The autumn sun was setting as Dr. Elena Martinez drove through the quiet streets of Pine Grove, her mind still buzzing with thoughts of her latest research breakthrough. She'd spent the last 14 hours in her laboratory running experiments that could potentially revolutionize cancer treatment. Her old Honda Civic hummed softly as she made her way home, dreaming of nothing more than a hot shower and her comfortable bed. The neighborhood streets were lined with massive oak trees, their branches heavy with leaves that created a natural canopy over the road. As she approached the intersection of Maple and Oak Street, she slowed down, squinting through the shadows. The street lights hadn't come on yet, and the tree coverage made it particularly dark at this hour. Elena carefully proceeded through the intersection, only to see red and blue lights flashing in her rearview mirror. Her heart sank. She'd been having such a good day with her research results, and now this. She pulled over promptly, turning on her interior light and placing both hands on the steering wheel, just as her father had taught her years ago. The police officer approached, his flashlight beam dancing across her side mirror. "License and registration," he said curtly, not even bothering with a greeting. Elena noticed his nameplate read Officer Reynolds. "Of course, officer," she replied politely, reaching for her documents. "May I ask what the problem is?" "You ran right through that stop sign back there," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Did you not see it, or do you just think traffic laws don't apply to you?" Elena blinked in surprise. "I'm sorry, officer, but I didn't see any stop sign." "Are you sure it wasn't hidden behind the tree branches? They're quite overgrown in this area." Officer Reynolds scoffed, shining his flashlight directly into her face. Elena squinted against the harsh light. "That's what they all say. And I suppose you have some important reason for being in such a hurry." "Actually, I'm coming from the university research lab. I'm a biochemist, and we've been working on some time-sensitive experiments." She kept her voice steady and professional, despite feeling increasingly uncomfortable with his attitude. "Right," he drawled, looking pointedly at her worn jeans and simple sweater. "A biochemist, and I'm the Queen of England." He chuckled at his own joke while writing out the ticket. Elena took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay calm. She'd dealt with prejudice before. Being a woman in science meant you developed a thick skin. But something about this interaction felt particularly unfair. She pulled out her phone and opened her camera app. "Officer, would you mind if I took some pictures of the stop sign? If it's truly visible, I'll gladly pay the fine, but I believe it's obscured by branches." "Do whatever you want," he replied dismissively, tearing off the ticket. "But save your stories for the judge. Court dates in 2 weeks. Sign here." Elena signed the citation, her hand steady despite her frustration. As the officer walked away, she noticed he didn't even bother to say good night or provide any safety instructions. Standard courtesies she'd seen extended to other drivers. Instead of heading home, Elena made a U-turn and parked safely near the intersection. She got out of her car, made sure her hazard lights were on, and took several clear photos of the stop sign, or rather, where the stop sign should have been visible. Just as she'd thought, the sign was almost completely hidden behind a mass of untrimmed oak branches. Even in broad daylight, it would have been difficult to spot. In the growing darkness, it was nearly impossible. As she climbed back into her car, Elena wasn't thinking about her tired feet or the dinner she'd skipped. Her mind was already formulating a plan. She'd present her case properly, with evidence and respect. After all, that's what she did best: gather data, analyze it, and present her findings. Whether in a laboratory or a courtroom, the truth was the truth. Little did Officer Reynolds know that the woman he dismissed so easily had just made a breakthrough that morning that would soon make headlines across the globe. But Elena wasn't concerned about recognition or status. She was more worried about how many other drivers might have received unfair tickets at this same intersection, especially those who couldn't afford to take time off work to fight them in court. 2 weeks passed quickly, and on a bright Tuesday morning, Elena found herself walking up the worn limestone steps of the Pine Grove County Courthouse. She had chosen to dress comfortably but neatly in dark jeans and a navy blazer, the same outfit she often wore while giving guest lectures at the university. The courthouse lobby buzzed with activity. People rushed back and forth, their footsteps echoing off the high marble walls. Elena checked the docket posted near the entrance and made her way to courtroom 3, where traffic violations were heard. The wooden benches were already filling up with other defendants, most looking nervous or resigned. She sat down quietly, pulling out her folder of evidence, the photos she'd taken of the obscured stop sign, a letter from the city's parks department acknowledging the overgrown tree issue, and even a small diagram she'd drawn showing the intersection's layout. Teaching had taught her the value of clear visual aids. As she waited, Elena observed the proceedings. A young man in a business suit contested his speeding ticket, claiming his speedometer was faulty. The judge listened patiently, eventually reducing his fine. A well-dressed older woman explained that she'd parked in a handicapped spot because she'd forgotten her permit at home. The judge dismissed her ticket entirely after she produced the valid permit. The clock on the wall ticked slowly. Elena watched as a delivery worker, still in his uniform, tried to explain that his parking ticket was issued while he was making an emergency delivery to a senior citizen. The judge barely let him finish speaking before enforcing the full fine. The man's shoulders slumped as he left the courtroom, probably losing most of his day's earnings to the fine. A local news reporter slipped into the back row, notepad in hand. Elena recognized her from the university press conferences, but didn't make eye contact. The reporter was likely here for a different story. The courthouse always had something newsworthy happening. The morning wore on, and Elena used the time to jot down notes about the different cases she observed. Her scientific mind couldn't help but notice patterns in how different people were treated. She started making a simple tally, noting dress, apparent profession, and outcome of each case. Around 11:30, a young clerk entered the courtroom with a stack of papers, distributing some to the judge's bench. The clerk did a double take when she saw Elena, her eyes widening slightly. Elena gave her a small, friendly smile, wondering if she recognized her from the university. Just before lunch break, Elena heard her name called. As she gathered her materials and walked to the defendant's podium, she couldn't help but notice how the judge barely glanced up from his papers. She stood straight, hands folded calmly in front of her, waiting to be addressed. The courthouse air conditioning hummed quietly in the background. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Elena could feel the eyes of the remaining defendants on her back, probably wondering if her case would give them any hints for their own. She thought about all the hours she'd spent in front of tough audiences, presenting research findings, defending theories, teaching complex concepts to skeptical students. This shouldn't be any different. The truth was on her side, just like in her lab work. All she needed was a fair chance to present her evidence. The judge finally looked up, his expression already showing signs of impatience before she even spoke a word. Elena took a deep breath, reminding herself of all the times she'd faced doubt and prejudice in her career, and how staying calm and professional had always served her best. Little did anyone in that courtroom know that at that very moment, emails were flying between Stockholm and her university department, finalizing the details of an announcement that would change her life forever. But right now, Elena wasn't thinking about awards or recognition. She was thinking about justice, fairness, and the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter who you are. "State your case," Judge Bradford said flatly, still shuffling through his papers as if Elena's presence was barely worth his attention. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and someone coughed in the back of the courtroom. "Your Honor, I'm here to contest a traffic citation I received 2 weeks ago," Elena began, her voice clear and steady. "The officer claimed I ran a stop sign, but I have evidence showing the sign was completely hidden by overgrown tree branches." The judge looked up briefly, his expression showing mild irritation. Do you expect us to believe you couldn't see a bright red stop sign? Those things are designed to be visible, you know. Alina pulled out her carefully prepared photos. If I may, Your Honor, I'd like to show you these photographs taken immediately after I received the ticket. She held them up, but before she could step forward to present them, the judge waved his hand dismissively. I've heard every excuse in the book, he interrupted, his tone growing more condescending. You mentioned you're some kind of scientist. He glanced at the paper in front of him, raising an eyebrow skeptically. Yes, Your Honor. I'm a biochemist at the university's research department. We're currently working on. A biochemist? He cut her off again, looking at her jeans and blazer with obvious doubt. And I suppose that makes you an expert on traffic laws, too. A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Alina felt her cheeks warm slightly, but she kept her composure. She'd faced tougher crowds during her doctoral defense. No, Your Honor, but I am an expert at gathering and presenting evidence. If you'll just look at these photographs. Ms. Martinez, the judge interrupted again, emphasizing the Ms. in a way that made it sound like an insult. Let me explain something. Every day, people come into my courtroom with photos, excuses, and stories. I have a full docket today, and frankly, I don't have time for elaborate presentations about tree branches. Alina took a deep breath. She thought about the delivery worker from earlier, about all the people who might have gotten unfair tickets at that same intersection. Your Honor, with all due respect, isn't the purpose of this court to examine evidence and ensure justice is served? The judge's face reddened slightly. Are you trying to tell me how to run my courtroom? I've been presiding over cases since before you were probably born. Not at all, Your Honor. I'm simply requesting the same courtesy and attention that was given to some of the previous cases this morning. For instance, the gentleman with the faulty speedometer was allowed to present his evidence. A sudden murmur went through the courtroom. The judge's eyes narrowed. I'm warning you, Ms. Martinez, your attitude isn't helping your case. Just then, the young clerk who had entered earlier rushed back into the courtroom, clutching a newspaper in one hand and a note in the other. She hurried up to the judge's bench, her shoes clicking rapidly against the floor. The clerk whispered something in the judge's ear, holding out what looked like a morning newspaper. Judge Bradford's expression shifted from annoyed to confused, then to something that looked almost like alarm. Alina stood quietly, still holding her photos. She noticed the reporter in the back row suddenly sitting up straighter, scribbling frantically in her notebook. The judge cleared his throat, the paper rattling slightly in his hands. His face had lost its reddish tinge and now looked slightly pale. He adjusted his glasses, looking at Alina with completely different eyes. Dr. Martinez, he said, his tone dramatically altered, perhaps we should examine your evidence more carefully. He emphasized the doctor this time, but Alina kept her expression neutral. The atmosphere in the courtroom had changed. The other defendants were leaning forward in their seats, sensing that something interesting was happening. The clerk stood off to the side, trying to hide a small smile. Alina simply nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. As I was saying about the photographs, she began her explanation again, thinking how funny it was that a simple newspaper could suddenly make someone see you as human. The morning newspaper trembled slightly in Judge Bradford's hands as he read the headline again. Local scientist wins Nobel Prize for revolutionary cancer research. Below it was a photo of Alina in her lab coat, smiling as she examined test results. The same woman who now stood before him in simple jeans and a blazer, waiting patiently to show him her evidence about a traffic ticket. The clerk couldn't contain her excitement. Dr. Martinez's research team made the breakthrough last month. She whispered loudly enough for the front rows to hear. The announcement just came from Stockholm this morning. It's all over the news. People in the courtroom began pulling out their phones, their fingers tapping quickly. Whispers spread like ripples in a pond. An older woman in the third row gasped softly, My sister's going through chemo right now. I just read about this new treatment. Alina stood quietly, still holding her photographs of the obscured stop sign. The sunlight streaming through the high windows caught the silver threads in her dark hair, earned through countless late nights in the lab, working towards this breakthrough that could help millions. Dr. Martinez, Judge Bradford said, his voice now carrying a note of respect that hadn't been there minutes before. Please continue with your evidence. He leaned forward, actually looking at her for the first time since she'd entered his courtroom. But Elena paused, glancing back at the remaining defendants waiting their turn. Your Honor, before I continue, may I say something? The judge nodded, looking slightly nervous about what might come next. The reporter in the back was now typing frantically on her phone, probably calling in the story to her editor. The truth about that stop sign doesn't change because of who I am or what I've achieved, Elena said softly but clearly. It was hidden by branches at 7 p.m. 2 weeks ago, whether I'm a Nobel Laureate or not. Just as it would be hidden for a delivery worker, a student, or anyone else driving through that intersection. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. The judge's face flushed again, but this time with what appeared to be shame rather than anger. He remembered how he'd dismissed her earlier attempts to speak, how he'd mocked her profession, how he treated her differently than the well-dressed defendants from the morning session. The clerk was now standing by the courthouse printer as it spat out page after page of news articles. Headlines flashed across screens throughout the room as more people read of the Nobel announcement. Elena's discovery had created a new way to target cancer cells while protecting healthy ones, work that could save countless lives. But she wasn't talking about cancer research now. She was talking about something just as important: fairness. Your Honor, may I show you those photographs now? She asked gently. Judge Bradford cleared his throat. Yes, of course, Dr. Martinez. Please approach the bench. His voice carried a mix of emotions: embarrassment, respect, and perhaps a touch of gratitude for her graceful handling of the situation. As Elena walked forward with her evidence, she heard more whispers behind her. But they weren't about the Nobel Prize anymore. She caught fragments. She's right, you know. And remember how he treated that delivery guy earlier? And always wondered about that intersection. The photos were clear and well documented, showing the stop sign from different angles. Elena had even included measurements and timestamps. The same attention to detail that had earned her science's highest honor was evident in her simple traffic court evidence. The judge studied the photos carefully, taking his time now. The morning sun had fully filled the courtroom, warming the old wooden benches and illuminating the scene. In that light, everything looked different: the judge, the courtroom, the whole situation. Sometimes it took a bright light to show what had been in the shadows all along. The courtroom atmosphere had transformed completely. Judge Bradford set down Elena's photos and removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes as if seeing the world anew. The whispers had grown into a gentle buzz of conversation, and more people were filing into the back of the courtroom, drawn by the spreading news. A young law student who had been observing cases all morning leaned forward in his seat, frantically taking notes. He'd just witnessed something they never taught in textbooks: how justice could wear different faces depending on who stood before it. Dr. Martinez, the judge began, his voice carrying a weight it hadn't held before. These photographs clearly show the stop sign was indeed obscured by foliage. He paused, collecting his thoughts. But I believe we have a larger issue to address here. Elena nodded quietly, knowing this moment wasn't just about her ticket anymore. Through the windows, she could see news vans starting to gather outside the courthouse. Word was spreading fast. A senior lawyer in the front row stood up. Your Honor, if I may. The judge nodded, perhaps grateful for the intervention. As a frequent practitioner in this court, I've observed that our rush to process cases quickly sometimes overshadows our duty to listen fully. The lawyer glanced at Elena with respect. Here we have someone who took the time to gather evidence, who tried to present a reasoned case, and who was, he cleared his throat diplomatically, not given the same consideration as others. Judge Bradford's face reddened again. The morning's earlier cases flashed through everyone's minds. The businessman with his speeding ticket, the well-dressed woman with her parking violation, the delivery worker who'd lost his day's wages. Just then, Officer Reynolds, who had issued the ticket, slipped into the courtroom. He'd heard about the Nobel Prize announcement and came to see for himself. His face showed a mix of shock and embarrassment as he recognized Elena, the woman he'd dismissed so condescendingly that evening. The judge noticed him and straightened in his chair. "Officer Reynolds, please approach the bench." The officer walked forward slowly, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Having reviewed Dr. Martinez's evidence, it appears the stop sign at Maple and Oak Street is indeed obscured by branches. How many tickets have been issued at that intersection? Officer Reynolds shuffled uncomfortably. In the past month alone, probably about 20, Your Honor. A murmur ran through the courtroom. That was 20 people who might have faced the same unfair situation. 20 people who might not have had the confidence, time, or resources to challenge their tickets. Elena spoke up softly, "Your Honor, perhaps this is an opportunity, not just to address one ticket or one intersection, but to look at how we all make quick judgments based on appearances." The young clerk, still standing near the judge's bench, nodded vigorously. She'd seen countless cases where people were treated differently based on how they looked or dressed. Judge Bradford took a deep breath. The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows in the courtroom. Sometimes it takes the brightest light to see our own shadows clearly. "Dr. Martinez is right," he announced, his voice carrying authority again, but of a different kind now. "This court needs to do better. Officer Reynolds, I want a full review of all citations issued at that intersection." He turned to Elena. "And Dr. Martinez, while I'm dismissing your ticket, I believe we all owe you a debt of gratitude, and not just for your groundbreaking medical research." People in the courtroom began to stir, sensing they were witnessing something important. The reporter in the back had stopped typing, realizing this story had become about much more than a Nobel Laureate fighting a traffic ticket. Elena gathered her photos quietly, thinking about all the experiments that had failed before her breakthrough. Sometimes the most important discoveries happen when you're willing to look at things differently, whether in a laboratory or a courtroom. The real test wasn't about proving her innocence anymore. It was about using this moment to create lasting change. By early afternoon, the courthouse steps had become a buzzing hub of activity. News reporters gathered with their microphones and cameras, while curious onlookers stopped to watch the scene unfold. The story had spread like wildfire through social media. A Nobel Prize winner facing bias in traffic court had struck a chord with people. Inside the courthouse lobby, Elena stood quietly near a tall marble pillar, checking messages on her phone. Her university colleagues had been trying to reach her all morning about the Nobel announcement, unaware she was dealing with a simple traffic ticket that had turned into something much bigger. "Dr. Martinez," a soft voice called out. She looked up to see the delivery worker from earlier, who had lost his case and his day's wages. He twisted his worn cap in his hands nervously. "I just wanted to say, thank you, for speaking up in there." Before Elena could respond, others began approaching. A young mother with a stroller mentioned how she'd gotten a ticket at the same intersection last month, but couldn't afford to take time off work to contest it. A college student shared how he'd been treated dismissively in court last week, his evidence never even looked at. The courthouse security guard, who had watched proceedings in that courtroom for 15 years, shook his head in wonder. "Never seen anything like it," he said to no one in particular. Judge Bradford actually listening, really listening. Through the glass doors, camera flashes flickered as reporters interviewed people leaving the courthouse. Some talked about the Nobel Prize, but most focused on what had happened in the courtroom. The story of bias and justice was hitting home for many. Officer Reynolds stood off to the side, engaged in a serious conversation with his supervisor. They were reviewing a stack of papers, records of all the tickets issued at that problematic intersection. The officer kept glancing over at Alina, clearly struggling with his own lessons from this morning. A group of law students had gathered around their professor, who had come to observe after hearing about the unfolding events. "This is the kind of case that changes things," the professor explained. "Not because of who Dr. Martinez is, but because she made us all see something we've been overlooking." The young clerk who had brought in the newspaper hurried past, carrying a fresh stack of papers. "Judge Bradford's reviewing every case from the past month," she whispered excitedly to her colleague. "He's called in 2 other judges to help. They're going to check for patterns of bias in their rulings." Near the courthouse entrance, a city maintenance truck pulled up. Workers began unloading equipment. They were heading to the intersection to trim the branches around the stop sign immediately. One worker commented that they'd start checking all intersections in the area for similar issues. Alina's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her research team about the Nobel announcement press conference scheduled for tomorrow. She smiled, thinking how different these 2 parts of her life were, yet how they collided in an unexpected way. A local community organizer approached Alina carefully. "Dr. Martinez, would you consider speaking at our town hall next week? We've been trying to address issues of bias in our local justice system for years. Your experience today, it makes people listen." The afternoon sun slanted through the courthouse windows, creating long shadows on the marble floor. More people were arriving, community leaders, curious citizens, even a few other judges who had heard about what happened. They weren't coming to see a Nobel Laureate. They were coming because a simple traffic court case had cracked open a larger conversation about fairness and dignity. Alina looked around at all the activity, all the conversations starting, all the small changes already beginning. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs, whether in science or society, start with someone simply pointing out what others have failed to see. Back in his chambers, Judge Bradford sat at his desk, surrounded by case files from the past 6 months. His usual confident posture was replaced by a troubled slouch as he reviewed case after case, seeing patterns he'd never noticed before, or perhaps had chosen not to see. The security camera footage from the courtroom lobby played on his computer screen. He watched himself that morning before the Nobel Prize revelation. How he'd smiled warmly at the businessman in the expensive suit, how he patiently listened to the well-dressed woman's parking excuse, and then how his entire demeanor had changed with other defendants. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of a long day's realizations. His clerk entered with another stack of files and a fresh cup of coffee. "The media's requesting an interview, Your Honor," she said gently. "They want your response to what happened this morning." She paused, then added, "The video clips from the courtroom security feed are already spreading online." Judge Bradford rubbed his temples. In his 20 years on the bench, he prided himself on being fair and just. But today had forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes our worst biases are the ones we don't even realize we carry. His phone lit up with a text from his daughter, a second-year law student. "Dad, we just discussed what happened in your courtroom in my legal ethics class. Proud of you for doing the right thing once you realized the mistake." The computer screen still showed the lobby footage. He watched as the delivery worker left the courthouse earlier that morning, shoulders slumped, counting the few bills left in his wallet. That same worker had returned later, standing straighter, hope renewed by what he'd witnessed in Dr. Martinez's case. "Your Honor." His clerk was still waiting. "There's something else. The other judges want to meet. They're suggesting a complete review of court procedures, especially in traffic and small claims cases." Judge Bradford nodded slowly. He picked up a framed photo from his desk, his swearing-in ceremony 20 years ago. He remembered the oath he'd taken to administer justice fairly and impartially. Today had shown him how easy it was to drift away from that promise without even noticing. Outside his window, he could see Officer Reynolds talking to a group of fellow officers. They were gathered around a map of the city, marking intersections that needed checking. The simple traffic stop that had started all this was leading to real changes, rippling out in unexpected ways. His email inbox was filling up with messages from other judges across the state. Word had spread fast in the legal community. Some shared similar experiences of realizing their own biases. Others asked for advice on implementing review procedures in their courts. A printout of the morning's Nobel Prize announcement lay on his desk next to all the case files. The contrast was striking. Dr. Martinez had changed the world with her cancer research, but today she changed something else just as important. She'd held up a mirror to the justice system itself. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across his desk as Judge Bradford began writing. Not a response to the media, but a new set of guidelines for his courtroom. Simple things really, ensuring every defendant got the same time to speak, requiring clear documentation of how similar cases were handled, implementing regular reviews for bias in decisions. His clerk returned with more files. The public defender's office sent over data from the past year, she said. They've been tracking disparities in how different defendants are treated. They never thought anyone would listen before. Judge Bradford stood up and walked to his window. The courthouse steps were still busy with reporters and community members. He watched as a maintenance crew loaded up their truck, finished with fixing the stop sign that had started it all. You know, he said quietly, more to himself than his clerk, sometimes it takes someone holding up a mirror to see what's been right in front of us all along. Rather than simply dismissing her ticket and moving on, Elena stood before the packed courtroom to address the bigger issue at hand. The afternoon session had turned into an impromptu community forum, with people from all walks of life filling the benches. Your Honor, Elena began, her voice clear and steady. I'd like to share some numbers with you. She pulled out a small notebook where she'd been keeping track during her morning in court. In the 3 hours I sat here today, I watched 23 cases. The average time spent on cases involving well-dressed professionals was 8 minutes. For everyone else, it was less than 2. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The young law student in the back whispered to his classmate. She was doing a real-time study of the court, even while waiting for her own case. Elena continued, pulling out more papers from her folder. I've also gathered data from public records. In our county, certain neighborhoods receive 4 times as many traffic citations as others, despite having similar population sizes and traffic patterns. Judge Bradford leaned forward, his reading glasses perched on his nose. The same attention he dismissed earlier was now commanding the room's full attention. Even the bailiff had stopped shuffling papers to listen. But numbers are just part of the story, Elena said, gesturing to the people in the courtroom. Behind each citation is a person who might miss work to contest it, lose a day's wages, or be unable to fight it at all. The delivery worker from the morning session stood up. I've gotten 3 tickets this year at that same intersection, he said. Lost money every time I came to court, so I started just paying them even though I knew something wasn't right about that stop sign. Others began sharing their stories too. A night shift nurse described how she'd been treated when she came to court still in her scrubs. A college student talked about feeling intimidated into paying a fine he couldn't afford. An elderly gentleman shared how he'd been too afraid to speak up when his case was rushed through. Elena listened to each story, jotting down notes. The scientist in her was gathering data, but the human in her was hearing the pain behind each experience. Your Honor, she continued, in my lab, we have a saying. The solution often reveals itself when you look at the problem from a different angle. She pulled out one final document, a proposal she'd written during her wait in court. I'd like to suggest establishing a community review board for traffic court procedures. Not just lawyers and judges, but people from all parts of our community. Let's look at how we can make the system work fairly for everyone. The young clerk, who had been typing frantically to keep up, noticed Judge Bradford nodding slowly. Other court officials were taking notes, and the reporter's pen hadn't stopped moving for minutes. We could start with simple changes, Elena suggested. Clear signage about people's rights in multiple languages. Evening court sessions for those who can't miss work. A regular review of citation patterns to check for unfair targeting. A senior lawyer stood up. I've been practicing law for 30 years, he said, and I've never heard these issues addressed so clearly. Dr. Martinez, you've done more for justice today than many of us have done in our entire careers. Judge Bradford cleared his throat. Dr. Martinez, your Nobel Prize committee cited your ability to see patterns others missed. It seems you've brought that same skill to our courthouse today. He paused, looking around the room. I'm not just dismissing your ticket. I'm ordering the creation of this review board, effective immediately. The afternoon sun streamed through the high windows, illuminating the hope on people's faces. Real change often starts in unexpected places, like a scientist with a traffic ticket who decided to do more than just prove her own innocence. As the crowd began discussing details of the new review board, Elena thought about how similar this was to her research breakthroughs. Sometimes the biggest changes start with someone simply asking, is there a better way? 6 months later, the Pine Grove County Courthouse looked quite different. New signs in multiple languages welcomed visitors, clearly explaining their rights and court procedures. The benches in courtroom 3 were filled with people attending the monthly community review board meeting. Elena sat quietly in the back row, a small smile on her face as she watched Officer Reynolds present the latest traffic citation data. The same officer who had dismissed her that evening now worked closely with the community to identify and fix problem areas throughout the city. Since implementing our new procedures, Officer Reynolds reported, showing a simple chart, we've seen a 40% drop in contested tickets. Not because we're writing fewer tickets, but because we're being more thorough in our documentation and fairer in our enforcement. Judge Bradford, who now co-chaired the review board with a local community leader, nodded approvingly. Gone was his rushed demeanor from 6 months ago. Each case now received proper attention, regardless of who stood before him. The delivery worker who had lost his day's wages that fateful morning was now a regular board member. He had become a voice for working people who struggled to attend daytime court sessions. Thanks to his input, the court had started holding evening sessions twice a week. We've helped 37 people recover wrongly paid fines from that problematic intersection, he announced proudly. And the new flexible payment plans have made a real difference for folks who can't pay all at once. The young law student who had witnessed Elena's case was there too, now interning with the public defender's office. The changes here have become a case study at the law school, he shared. Other counties are starting to adopt our model. Elena's phone buzzed with a message, another invitation to speak about justice reform, this time from a national conference. While her Nobel Prize work continued to save lives in laboratories worldwide, her impact on the justice system had taken on a life of its own. The clerk who had brought in the newspaper that day was now the board's secretary. She stood up to share some numbers. In the past 6 months, we've reviewed over 500 cases. The average time spent per case has actually decreased, even though each person gets proper attention. Turns out, fairness is efficient too. Outside the courthouse, the stop sign at Maple and Oak Street stood clearly visible, its new solar-powered light ensuring it could be seen day or night. Regular maintenance checks had become standard throughout the city, and citation data was publicly available online. Judge Bradford approached Elena after the meeting. You know, Dr. Martinez, while you were working on your cancer research, you probably never imagined you'd also help cure a sick justice system. Elena smiled, remembering that evening 6 months ago. In science, we learned that some of the biggest discoveries come from unexpected places. Sometimes it takes a single moment to show us what needs to change. The afternoon sun painted the courthouse walls golden, just like that day. But now its light fell on new faces, new hopes, and new possibilities. On the wall hung a simple framed quote, Justice should be blind, but it must never be blind to injustice. As people filed out of the courtroom, chatting about the day's progress, the elderly gentleman who had once been afraid to speak up was telling a newcomer, "You should have seen how it used to be. Now, they actually listen to us." Alina gathered her things, ready to head back to her lab. Tomorrow, she would work on saving lives through science. But today, she had witnessed something just as important. Proof that when people come together, real change is possible. The security guard, watching the scene from his usual post, summed it up best. Who would have thought? All this good coming from one hidden stop sign, and one scientist who wasn't afraid to speak up. As the courthouse doors closed for the day, the setting sun cast long shadows across the steps. Shadows that now fell differently on a system that had learned to see itself more clearly. All because someone had dared to hold up a mirror to justice itself.